Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, for many, it was a speech designed to shock and appall. For others, Enoch Powell spoke a certain truth that no one else dared speak. Today marks 50 years since the politician's infamous Rivers of Blood speech, warning that Britain was under threat from mass immigration.
Well, at the time, it terrified migrants living here, but even today, there are people who support his ideas, no matter how inflammatory they might seem. Well, Sky's political correspondent Lewis Goodall has spent time in Powell's former constituency of Wolverhampton to see what impact that speech still has today.
By the late 1960s, hundreds of thousands of Commonwealth citizens had made their home in Britain, including the Jaspels, who hailed from India but settled in Wolverhampton.
This is the first passport my mum had.
Oh, wow.
When she came. It's the, we've kept it.
Oh, wow. How old is she there? So
she's about 35, 36 there.
And so when did they come over?
We actually came in 1965.
It was exactly these sorts of families whom Powell had in mind when he rose to speak.
Watching a nation busily engaged in heaping up its own funeral pyre.
It was electric, the first time a major politician had spoken out against the establishment consensus on immigration which had held between both parties since the war. And he did so in a way designed to shock. He would, he told a friend, send a firework and light up the sky. Milkinder grew up to be mayor of Wolverhampton and remembers the impact the speech had on his community.
This is the street, when the speech by Enoch Powell was made, this is where we actually lived.
You and your family?
Yes.
Your parents and the community at the time, what did they make of it?
They were petrified, terrified, they were very nervous, they were very worried because the implication was that immigrants need to go back home, that we would be thrown out of the country. The impact it had was that my mother never ever changed her nationality because of that speech.
Why? Because she thought she would be thrown out?
Because
she needed somewhere to go home to?
Yes, and this is the house where we actually lived when the speech was made.
Much of the speech doesn't exist on tape, but it wasn't surprising that Milkinder's mother was scared. Powell was saying not only that immigration should cease, but that everything should be done to encourage her and her family to leave, and that if she didn't, the character of Britain itself as a nation would be lost. It split the country down the middle. But Powell was right that his constituents, the white working class, were largely behind him.
Big porters of Smithfield marched in protest in support of Enoch Powell.
Dangerous, it was populist, it was playing to the worst sentiments which were then quite widespread.
They thought this was visionary, this was long overdue, it should be implemented, this was the new Messiah. I remember saying to my agent at the time, if Enoch Powell stood for leadership of the Conservative Party today, he would sweep the board.
The institutions which not just the majority, but the vast majority wish to maintain shall be destroyed.
There are phrases in that speech which really are unwise, unpleasant, absolutely calculated to excite someone who did have racialist feelings.
Allies of Powell say this was never about racism, but about numbers.
The sheer weight of immigrants that were settling in certain areas was going to cause difficult social relations. And Powell had been a soldier in India in the Second World War. He left just before partition, and he'd seen the beginnings of communal violence between Muslims and Hindus in India, and I think he was incredibly concerned that it might happen here. This speech was delivered just over a fortnight after Martin Luther King's assassination, and America was being torn apart by racial riots.
But for his critics, this wasn't about America or India. It was about the law closer to home.
It was time to try and make the Conservative Party take an opposition stance against legislation which made it illegal to discriminate on grounds of colour, class or creed. This was not about immigrants, it was about what happens to people here. We had a small employment agency where people had to fill in a form. Time and again we'd get scrolled across these forms the word "no colours."
Powell said that he wasn't speaking on behalf of himself, but on behalf of his constituents of this place, of Wolverhampton, because he argued that their concerns weren't being listened to, that they were being suppressed by a powerful group of elites, a group of people who were trying to steal his constituents' country away from them. Sound familiar? Well, it should, because Enoch Powell was the first British modern populist. He was the midwife of the politics of identity and of betrayal.
50 years on, Powellite questions of identity politics, sovereignty and nationalism cast a long shadow.
I think we live in the age of Powell. I think if you take that speech in 1968 and you strip away the clipped academic tones and you strip away the classical allusions and the rhetorical flourishes, what you have is the manifesto for modern populism. It's the idea that speaking out against immigration is the act of a courageous and visionary statesman. It's the idea that what immigrants want is not equality, it is domination. What they want is the whip hand over the local population. It's the idea that what liberalism is about giving privileges and preferences to minority groups. And that has been the platform of populist politics ever since.
In a way, our politics runs straight through Powell's rivers of blood. His arguments against the EU, elites and nationhood have become mainstream. And there are many, in places like the Black Country, on whose behalf he spoke then, for whom he still speaks now.
I was brought up in Wolverhampton, in the area that he used to represent, so I was brought up with that name of Enoch being constantly mentioned to me all the time. He's a hero, I think, to many people, not just white working class people.
We could resurrect him now. Do you think he might get elected if he stood around these parts?
Yeah.
He'd get elected in Dudley or Wolverhampton?
He'd get more votes than me, for sure. Yeah, no question about it. Yeah, I think that he would do extremely well.
They found their wives unable to obtain hospital beds in childbirth, their children unable to obtain school places, their homes and neighbourhoods changed beyond recognition, their plans and prospects for the future changed beyond recognition because of immigration.
Right, okay.
What do you think of it? Think it sounds right, on the money, totally wrong?
Yeah, well, absolutely, because there's no room for anybody because of immigration. Obviously, they've come over, took a lot of schools up, took a lot of housing benefits up, and there's no room for us English residents and our children and whatnot.
Did you know about Enoch Powell?
Yeah.
What did you think of him?
I think he was a great bloke. I think, and what he said would happen.
So when he said that, when he predicted that in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man would have the whip hand over the white man,
yeah, but
man, do you
yes.
think that was right? Do you think he was right about that?
I do, yeah. I do, yeah. I can see that coming.
On the other side of Wolverhampton, at West Park Primary, there's a very different vision of Britain on show. This school, criticised by Powell in the 60s as a place with almost no white children, is rehearsing a play which tells both his and their story and which rejects his checkered legacy.
They know what racism is, they know it's ugly, they know it's important to speak out against it. This is a thriving community with so many positive things to say about itself that it thrives off the energy that you can get from diversity. In a way, he's shot himself in the foot by saying what he said, because I think it's only motivated a lot of people in this community to prove him wrong.
It doesn't matter where you go in the world, you'll find white, black, Asian, it doesn't matter where you are, you'll find people of different skin colours.
He's wrong to be racist because everyone has the right to be treated equally, and it makes me feel very uncomfortable hearing it.
He impacted too many people's life and made so much people go from this country and move to somewhere else.
All political careers end in failure, Powell once famously observed, and it never seemed truer than for his own life. But he believed he would be vindicated by history.
Regret that you're going to be predominantly remembered for this speech when one looks at your other political achievements?
I think I shall also be remembered as an opponent of Britain's membership of the European Community. And when that has finally collapsed, I think my name will be on the roll of honour.
Powell died in 1998. He's buried here in Warwick in the church of his wartime regiment.
By almost any standards, Enoch Powell was a racist, he was a sexist. We would have no compunction today in calling him a bigot. But what he also was, what you can also say about Enoch Powell, is that he was a patriot. It's the reason he's buried here under these colours. But a patriot to what? To an idea of Britain, to a type of Britain that even by his own time was already slipping away.
Powell was a man of enormous intellectual gifts, yet he was oblivious to the ironies of that which he bequeathed us. He had wanted a debate on immigration, but for years debate was stifled by a speech he made. He feared the division of a nation, yet who or what was Britain divided by more than Enoch Powell himself?
Well, join me now to discuss the legacy of that speech 50 years on are the political commentator and broadcaster Nicholas Jones, whose family knew Enoch Powell well, and the director of the Runnymede Trust, Dr. Omar Khan. Welcome to you both. Dr. Khan, perhaps we should start by saying that whether people sympathise or not with what Enoch Powell said, he was wrong. I mean, his predictions did not come to pass.
Yeah, I think he was wrong in terms of the level of violence. There hasn't been any violence, but it's not just that we haven't seen bad things, we've seen good things. We see 17 conservative black and minority ethnic MPs. He thought that was impossible. He thought that black people could never be English, could never be British. We see black and minority ethnic cabinet members. We also see, if you look at the distribution of populations, there are no neighborhoods where there are only black and minority ethnic people. In London, there's no ward where there's more than 50% of an ethnic minority population. So, you know, the idea that there are going to be these clusters of areas where there are no English people, where there are black faces only, that just hasn't been true. The idea that we're going to be, you know, that there's going to be violence and tension inevitably following from it. The only violence and tension we have is white racists who take up his legacy and try to beat people up.
Nick, your father was a senior journalist in Wolverhampton. You're a second-generation journalist. Enoch Powell made the speech about what was happening in Wolverhampton. Do you think he gave an accurate picture of what was going to transpire?
Well, there was no doubt about it. You're quite right. First of all, that my father knew Powell extremely well and had advised him on how he should promote himself and had been forewarned. You heard in your report just a few moments ago about the prediction that the speech was going to go up like a rocket and the stars were going to stay up
your
there.
Father is going to have a fizz.
That's right. That was the very conversation. So if we look at the test from my father's point of view, he had that very difficult job as a newspaper editor of trying to provide balanced coverage. But if you get back to your question about whether whether Powell was representing the concerns of people in Wolverhampton, and we heard in the interviews that those concerns among some people remain today. I mean, there was no doubt about it. The Express and Star, that's the newspaper, was at the time reporting that the pressure that was on for housing and for schools and for family maternity services. Now, my father believed that that was being exploited by the National Front, and he believed that Powell fell for that National Front propaganda and used it.
With Powell over this.
Yes, of course, there was a family breakup over it. Yes, a very, very traumatic moment, and it was a very traumatic time for the local newspaper. You heard there in your film, there was Michael Heseltine's prediction that Powell could have swept the country and become Prime Minister. Well, in Wolverhampton, of course, Powell was the hero. 90% of the letters to of the local paper were in support of Enoch Powell. And there's an echo of it today with the campaign by Powell supporters to put up a blue plaque for Enoch Powell in Wolverhampton.
Although the current MP of Wolverhampton is, of course, a black woman who was an NHS nurse. There's some irony, I think, in that. And the previous MP was a conservative Sikh gentleman. So, you know, the sort of legacy in Wolverhampton now is much more mixed. I think it's important also not just to focus on Powell alone. I mean, you heard in your excellent piece there of a family that decided not to take British citizenship because they were worried about whether or not they might be kicked out. And this same week, we're talking about Windrush generation individuals who also citizenship status is in question. And in the same year that he rose to object to the 68 Race Relations Act, which Heseltine has correctly highlighted, there was a 68 Immigration Act, which also clamped down on people based on where their grandparents were born. So it's not true that Powell has had no impact, of course, on the way in which we think about race, nationality, and identity.
And also in that clip from the interview I did with him 25 years ago, I mean,
Yes.
he's making the point that, you know, he thought he'd be remembered for saving Britain from the European
Union.
And look
Yes.
what's happened.
And look what's happened. And of course, that was the very point why you said I was a second-generation journalist. What had fascinated me, you see, was the degree to which Powell had understood how to use the media. And of course, what we've seen subsequently, Adam, is, and it is quite significant, isn't it, how subsequently we saw the fear of immigration. Powell was using that for political gain. We saw how that was used, for example, by UKIP, how it's been used very successfully by Nigel Farage, and we've seen even now how Donald Trump used social media and the fear of immigration as a very important weapon. So that's what I think is another of the legacies of Powell, as your report pointed out.
His supporters, of course, say he wasn't a racist, because he was a racialist, is the phrase they used, because it wasn't about black or brown people, it was just about absolute levels of people coming in from outside. Do you accept that?
Not really, if you read the speech. I mean, he has actually a bigger complaint about the future children. He's more agitated, and in fact, your piece talked about Martin Luther King, that the future black and Asian British-born population are a bigger concern for him, that they'll never be able to settle in, that they'll be confused about where they actually belong. And I think it shows that he's been absolutely wrong about the ability of black and brown British people to feel part of this country, to contribute to this country. But we still have some way to go, I think, for them to feel fully equal. And I think his legacy, unfortunately, carries on in how black and minority ethnic people feel about their Britishness, and we're seeing that this week.
Okay, thank you both very much indeed.
Well, let's take a closer look at the legacy of that speech and what it means in modern Britain. Well, I'm joined now by Ash Sarkar, Senior Editor at Novara Media, and Peter Whittle, UKIP London Assembly Member. Very good morning to both of you. Let me start with you, Peter Whittle. Do you think that Britain is a racist country today?
No, I don't. I think that it is a huge slander, actually, to say that Britain or British people are racist. I think that they are no more or less racist, in fact, a lot less racist than most other countries, many other countries in the world. And I think that this narrative that has to be kept in place, that somehow this is a racist country, is incredibly damaging.
Oh, and Ash Sarkar, let me bring you in on that. What do you think? Is Britain a racist country today? Have we evolved from the times of Enoch Powell's speech?
I mean, obviously a lot has changed since the time of Enoch Powell. But, you know, the reason why I'm smiling is that almost exactly a year ago, Sky News brought me in to discuss this exact topic, is Britain racist? And yet the conversation has not moved forward from that point. And what worries me is that multiple independent organisations, including Theresa May's own race disparity audit, has found evidence of institutionalised racist discrimination. And yet we keep debating whether or not racist discrimination even exists. We wouldn't do the same over, say, climate change. Why do we keep questioning the existence of endemic social problems rather than trying to fix them?
What do you say to that, Peter Whittle, and to accusations that because of the whole sort of febrile environment around the whole Brexit campaign, that this sort of anti-immigration, you roll your eyes, but it's what people say.
Yes, exactly, because this is the narrative. This is the narrative that somehow or other people who voted for Brexit, we're talking about, I was brought on here to talk about Enoch Powell and is Britain a racist country, and you go straight to Brexit. I mean, the fact is that the people who voted for Brexit voted because they wanted to get control of our borders, they wanted our sovereignty back. That does not make them racist bigot, xenophobic or anything. And this is something which you just slip into a question like that as though it's actually a fact.
Well, it's a
Now,
very
on the
natural question when you consider...
It is not a natural question.
Home
It
Office
is not something that
statistics-
you take for granted.
Home Office statistics, which showed hate crimes rose 29%. They peaked right after the referendum result.
Hate
And
crime
80% of those are race hate crimes.
Hate crimes, right, so-called hate crimes which you're talking about there, they are hate incident statistics. They go straight onto the statistics, whether or not actually they are prosecuted or even if they are convicted as a result. If you look at the number of convictions that come from that, basically it's very, very small. It's a fraction. This was something which had to be basically to build up the narrative that somehow or other this great hate was unleashed. I'm sick and tired of British people being slandered in this way, right? When it comes to hate crime, it is an unusual thing in that it requires no evidence whatsoever. It just simply requires the say-so of the person who might be offended. That could be someone just listening to this programme now. It could be someone who's not even watching, but actually is told about it.
Let me bring Ash Sarkar in here, because she's shaking her head. Well, your response to Peter Whittle's comments.
The reason why I'm quite alarmed by his remarks is that once again we see someone denying the evidence in front of his very eyes. So why don't we move it on from hate crimes, which you say are subjective? Why don't we look at something like housing? In the past 5 years, we've seen a 22% increase in statutory homelessness. But then you break that down by race. That's a 9% increase for white people, a 71% increase in statutory homelessness for Asian people. So here we've got institutional racism. It doesn't necessarily need an individual perpetuating it, but we've got these endemic racialized outcomes. And the problem with getting, with all due respect to my fellow debater, someone who's representing a party which is polling lower than the Liberal Democrats, which is really quite some achievement, well, the problem with getting someone like him on is that he is to be trusted on this matter the way we would trust Nigel Lawson on climate change, i.e. not at all.
I think you're revealing yourself by your comments there. If you want to take my party on fire, and we can, it will be very boring, actually. But the fact of the matter is, I'm on here, presumably because I was actually elected, right? Are you elected to anything?
Well, let me just
and yet
ask
you're
you,
on here too.
I'm here as a journalist, my friend.
Your party does have a problem, a reputational problem with racism, does it not? I mean, your former leader said that the basic principles of the Rivers of Blood speech were correct. I mean, what's your view? How do you defend your party's reputation when it comes down to being racist?
Absolutely. There's nothing racist about my party. When people have actually said things that have been racist in the party, they have been got rid of. That has always been the case.
But there's been a whole load of them, though.
You want to talk about racism in England at the moment. We do actually have a problem with racism. We have got one of the main political parties. It's riddled with anti-Semitism and a leader who seems absolutely to do not anything about it and no intention of doing anything about it. Why don't you discuss that instead of attacking UKIP? The fact of the matter is, right, the overall effect of the Enoch Powell speech was somehow to make all discussions of immigration, which is one topic, linked immediately with race. And that has been one of the main problems with it, I think, because the two are completely separate. And this is a problem which came about because obviously he was fired, and after that all kind of discussion has pretty much been closed down.
Your response to that, Ash Sarkar?
There's a cultural theorist called Stuart Hall, an amazing cultural theorist, who wrote that while Mr. Powell lost, Powellism itself had won, because the achievement of the Rivers of Blood speech was that it drew together immigration, race and anxieties around the nation state. And this played out with sometimes fatal consequences. In the 60s and 70s, we had racist hate crimes like the murder of Altab Ali, and more recently, we will mark another anniversary, the 25-year anniversary of the murder of Stephen Lawrence. And it's nearly 20 years since the Macpherson report gave us that phrase, institutional racism. I don't think that we are adequately dealing with these issues. And weirdly enough, I agree with my fellow debater in that racism is not simply a matter of the right wing. It's something that permeates the entirety of our political culture. And the only way we are going to be able to deal with it successfully is if we're really honest about ourselves about that fact. I think that we see the afterlife of Enoch Powell in Theresa May's hostile environment policy. I also think that we've seen it in New Labour's obsession with the asylum issue, or some comments by Labour MPs about their constituency being a tinderbox that's ready to go up in race riots at any second. This is the impact of Enoch Powell's speech. It's not contained to the right wing, though I think it's much more powerful there, and it takes all of us, each and every one of us, to confront that tendency within our own political circles.
Just one very brief final word from you, Peter Whittle, on this discussion.
I totally reject that Britain is endemically racist. I think there's no question that it is not. I think it's always been a very welcoming society. And I repeat, talking about immigration, and of course, Powell was talking about 50,000 people a year. We're now talking about between 1/4 and 1/3 of a million people a year. It is completely different. It is not racist to be concerned about that.
OK, Peter Whittle from UKIP and Ash Sarkar from Novara Media, thank you very much indeed.
Well, a diversity event is taking place today at the Burlington Hotel in Birmingham, where 50 years ago Mr Powell delivered that speech. Former West Bromwich Albion footballer Brendan Batson is going to be speaking at the event. Pleased to say he joins us live now. Brendan, good to speak to you. I think you were a teenager at the time of this speech. Do you remember it and what your reaction was when you heard it?
I don't remember it at the time. I wasn't politicised at that time of my life, but I remember it later on and followed the speech, obviously the text of it, and I realised it impacted on me in my career as a footballer, because that speech almost emboldened the far right, the National Front, and they use football and the crowds of football as a bit of a recruiting ground. So I played at West Brom with the late Laurie Cunningham and Cyril Regis, bless them both. And we were targeted by the National Front, and I think it's a direct result of that speech by Enoch Powell.
Tell us about today's event. Why do you feel it's important to take place, in this exactly the same spot?
Well, obviously because of the symbolism of it, but also I think I can share my journey and show that I'm a good example of immigration at its best, because, Enoch Powell's speech painted such a bleak picture of what immigration may be to this country, and I think it's been proven year in, year out that he was totally wrong in his vision.
And the breadth of speakers you have there today reflects that as well.
Yes, it does. I think everybody will have a story to tell. We'll share our journeys. It's quite poignant at the moment with all the stuff going on with the Windrush debacle, and I'm part of that Windrush generation as well. I came in '62, so I think it's important that we share our experiences and show that, with all the tensions that we may have had, we've worked through those, we've been able to get along, and as I say, as somebody's mentioned, Great Britain is a very welcoming place, and we've learned to live side by side, and it's a better country as a result of immigration.
Yeah, you feel like the UK, we've just had a rather heated discussion about how far the UK has come. All the things you've just mentioned in the last few minutes, the speech, your experience of racism as a footballer, the Windrush scandal at the moment. Where do you assess the UK in terms of progress since that speech?
Well, listen, things have got a lot better. I can remember being abused as a young boy when I first arrived in England. Boys driving along in cars, shouting names at me. As a player, going to grounds where black players were abused in the 70s. Things have got a lot better, but I think we're at a little bit, not a tipping point, but I think because of Brexit, because of austerity over the years, there is a tension in the air, there's no question about it, and I think we have to be very careful that we don't slide back into the bad old days.
Brendan Batson, thank you for taking the time to speak to us.
Well, for many, it was a speech designed to shock and appall. For others, Enoch Powell spoke a truth no one else dared speak. Today marks 50 years since his infamous Rivers of Blood speech, warning that Britain was under threat from mass immigration. At the time, it terrified migrants living here. But even today, there are people who support his ideas, no matter how inflammatory they might seem. Well, to discuss that infamous speech and its legacy 50 years on, I'm joined by Labour peer and former Cabinet Minister Lord Adonis, who wrote a letter to the head of Ofcom asking for a broadcast of that speech on its anniversary to be blocked. Lord Adonis, thank you very much indeed for joining us. The broadcast went ahead. What justification were you given by the BBC and Ofcom?
Well, they said they thought it was a matter of public interest because, of course, it was a speech that caused huge controversy at the time. My argument, which I stand by, is that if a politician tried to make a speech like that, predicting blood flowing through the streets and the rivers, the black man holding the whip hand over the white man, and lots of really outrageous statements in that speech. If they tried to make that speech today, they'd be prosecuted for incitement to religious hatred and to racial hatred and violence, which is the right thing, because we can't have, free speech is a great thing to have in a society, but people shouldn't be free to incite one group of people to start fighting another group of people, which is essentially what Enoch Powell did. So I think it's a mistake to broadcast it, and it's very important that we define ourselves as a country for squarely against what Enoch Powell was saying. What he was predicting was race riots. He was predicting a society that would, where there would be bloodshed if we continue to have immigration, and he was calling for people to be sent back to the countries from which they came. Those were evil sentiments. They have no place in modern Britain, and I don't think that they should be broadcast.
No, and those predictions today look totally out of kilter with modern society, but it was a moment in history. It was a speech that was made 25 years ago, and on that logic, should we not then broadcast the words of Hitler or Mussolini, for example?
Well, it was broadcast 50 years ago, not 25 years ago, as you just said. And it's important that the difference in those dates is important. This is now a whole, I'm glad to say, closed chapter of British history. But the problem about closed chapters of history is that they can be reopened again. And anyone who's looking at what's happening in Britain with our debates about Brexit at the moment knows that immigration is a very toxic issue. Now, to be fair, no one is making speeches like Nigel Farage's, like Enoch Powell's. And it's we haven't been opening that door again, but you can't keep it too firmly shut. Allowing racism and violence to breed in any society is an evil thing, and we need to be very clear that it's not happening. Now, so far as Hitler's concerned, it's quite interesting that, of course, for 2 generations after the Second World War, there was an effective ban on broadcasting Hitler and anything to do with Nazism in Germany, because it was so toxic in Germany. And they're a modern society that, of course, prizes free speech too. And though, of course, Enoch Powell wasn't anything like as bad as Hitler, it was an evil thing that he did, trying to set one part of society against another and predicting bloodshed and violence. And we do need to keep that firmly in its box. And the 50th anniversary we should be marking today is not a celebration or any discussion of the virtues of Enoch Powell, which if you go on social media you'll see there's a lot of. We should be proclaiming that this is a closed chapter of our history which we have no intention whatsoever of reopening.
Has not the anniversary of this speech done just that? Because we have heard the voices loud and clear of anti-racism campaigners discussing just how wrong this speech was and the words were.
Well, unfortunately, it hasn't been as uniform as that. We also had people saying that his predictions and much of what he said was justified. We've had people, including eminent commentators, say he wasn't really a racist. What he was doing was acting as a commentator. He wasn't inciting racism. And as I say, if you go on social media and see a lot of the reaction to the BBC rebroadcast of his speech last Saturday, you'll find a lot, including some organisations closely associated with Brexit, which are busy saying that Powell was right and that all that he said would happen in British society has come to pass in terms of us being a much worse place for having immigration, particularly black immigration, and that we need to stop it forthwith. So it's only if you live in the sanitised world of the BBC and Sky that you can't see that there are forces out there which we absolutely don't want to pander to.
OK, Lord Adonis, thanks very much indeed for talking to us.
I've been